In the grey calm of August 17, 1945, a strange shape came in from the open Atlantic toward Mar del Plata on the Argentine coast. A U-boat, low and dark and running on the surface, headed for the harbour mouth. This would be U-977, arriving unannounced more than 3 months after the war in Europe had ended, and only 2 days after the war in the Pacific had ended as well. Its appearance, so long after the fighting was over and so far from home, would spark international headlines, official investigations in 3 countries, and a legend that has never entirely died, that this was the boat that carried Hitler, or Nazi gold, to a secret refuge across the sea. This is the story of U-977, the U-boat that escaped to Argentina. U-977 was a Type 7C, the most mass-produced U-boat of the Kriegsmarine. More than 500 of the C variant were built, and this was simply one more of them, launched in 1943 at the Blohm and Voss yard in Hamburg. It spent nearly 2 years at war without fighting in it. While other boats went out into the Atlantic to hunt and, more often than not, to die, U-977 stayed in the sheltered waters of the Baltic, training crews, running exercises, and it never fired a torpedo at an enemy in its life. Its record was not merely empty, but faintly embarrassing, for during those exercises, it collided with other vessels 3 times, and in the last of those accidents, it damaged its own pressure hull badly enough that the Navy gave up on it ever being a frontline boat and left it to a permanent training role. By the spring of 1945, it was a boat its own service had already written off. There was only one thing about the boat that would come to matter, and it was fitted in the final months of the war. Early in 1945, U-977 went into the yards at Hamburg to be equipped with a snorkel. It was a mast that could be raised while the boat ran just beneath the surface, drawing air down a tube so the diesels could run and recharge the batteries without the boat ever coming fully up. By 1945, it was close to a necessity, because Allied aircraft carrying radar had made the old way of fighting suicidal, and a U-boat caught on the surface was simply a target. For most crews, it was a way to live a little longer in a losing battle. For U-977, it would become the one piece of equipment that made an escape to the far side of the world even thinkable. Why a boat the Navy had written off was sent to fight at all is a question with a bleak answer. By the spring of 1945, the U-boat arm had been all but destroyed. The great wolf packs were gone, the aces were dead, and more than half of the boats that put to sea did not come back. And still, the boats were sent. With the frontline strength gutted, the Kriegsmarine reached into what was left, and what was left included training boats like U-977, damaged and second-rate and crewed by men who had never fired a torpedo in anger. On the 2nd of May 1945, with the Reich collapsing and Soviet troops fighting in the streets of Berlin, U-977 sailed from Kristiansand in Norway on its first war patrol, with orders to slip into the approaches of Southampton and sink whatever it found. For a Type 7 boat in 1945, in waters swarming with Allied aircraft and escorts, it was close to a sentence of death. And then, within days of sailing, the war it had finally been sent to fight simply ended, and this boat that had done nothing became one of the most talked about submarines in the world, for something that had nothing to do with fighting at all. U-977's commander was Heinz Schäffer, and he was only 24 years old. He was not new to the sea. He had made 4 war patrols as a junior officer aboard U-445, including one far south in the Gulf of Guinea, and he had commanded a small training boat, U-148, in the Baltic before U-977 was handed to him early in 1945. He was a competent and decorated officer, holding the Iron Cross and the U-boat war badge. But he had few illusions left about the war. He understood, as most U-boat men by then understood, that the campaign was lost, that airborne radar had turned the hunters into the hunted, and that a boat sent out in 1945 was as likely to be a coffin as a weapon. By his own later account, he regarded his new command less as a fighting machine than as a means of escape. He would need it to be exactly that. U-977 was still at sea, still outbound north of Scotland, when word came that Germany had surrendered and that Grand Admiral Dönitz had ordered every U-boat to give itself up. Schäffer received the order in garbled form and he had a decision to make that would define the rest of his life. He decided he would not surrender, and the reasons he gave later are worth stating plainly, because they explain the whole voyage and they cut against the legend that would follow. The U-boats still at sea when Germany fell had been given clear instructions. They were to surface, fly a black flag, report their positions, and make for the nearest Allied port to give themselves up. Most did exactly that. A great many others, unwilling to hand their boats to the enemy, opened their own valves and scuttled themselves where they lay, sending their boats to the bottom in a mass drowning of steel the Germans called Operation Regenbogen. U-977 would be one of a tiny handful of boats that simply refused to end the war in either of the ways they had been told to. Under interrogation after it was all over, Schäffer said that his main reason for running was fear of what awaited him in a defeated Germany. In the final months of the war, Nazi propaganda had told the German people that the Allies intended to reduce their country to empty fields and to enslave its men. Schäffer half believed it. He also remembered how badly German prisoners of war had been treated after the First World War, held for years before they were let home, and he wanted no part of that. And set against all of this was a hope that in Argentina, a country far from the war with a large and settled German community, he and his men might build a better life than the one waiting for them in the ruins of home. It was not the calculation of a fanatic on a secret mission. It was the calculation of a frightened young man who believed the worst about what defeat would mean and chose exile over surrender. He did not force that choice on his crew. Schäffer gave the married men among them the option to go ashore rather than follow him into an uncertain future on the far side of the world. 16 of them, about a third of the crew, took it. They were landed by dinghy near an island off Bergen on the 10th of May, and all of them ended up in British hands soon enough. The men who remained were mostly the young and the single, the ones with least waiting for them in Germany, and they stayed with the boat. There was, by Schäffer's own telling, considerable tension over the decision, something near a mutiny, though his is the only account of that, and he had every reason to tell the story in his own favour. What is certain is that when U-977 turned south, it did so with a reduced crew who had chosen, one way or another, to run. The voyage U-977 set out to make was one of the longest a single U-boat ever attempted. From the coast of Norway to the coast of Argentina is the better part of 8,000 miles, the length of the entire Atlantic Ocean from one hemisphere to the other, and the boat would cross it almost entirely alone and unseen. The route began off Norway, north of Scotland, where the boat turned its back on Europe and pointed south. It ran down through the grey waters west of the British Isles, giving a wide berth to the coasts where Allied aircraft were thickest and out into the open North Atlantic. From there, the track ran south and west, down past the Bay of Biscay far out to sea, along the bulge of West Africa, to the Cape Verde Islands, roughly the halfway point, where the crew came up for air and a swim, then across the equator into the South Atlantic, down the long empty stretch off the coast of Brazil, and finally in toward the Argentine shore and the harbour at Mar del Plata. It was a passage of some 108 days, from the first week of May to the middle of August, carrying a boat and 32 men from a Germany that no longer existed to a country on the far side of the world. That, at least, was the shape of the journey. How the boat actually made it is the part that made it famous, and it is also the part where the record splits in two. By Schäffer's account, the voyage south was one of the most remarkable feats of endurance in the history of the U-boat war. He said that from the 10th of May to the middle of July, the boat ran continuously submerged, hidden beneath the surface on its snorkel for 66 days without once surfacing, creeping down the length of the Atlantic while the world above went about the business of peace. 66 days underwater, he claimed, a passage second in length only to one other boat in the entire war. He described it as an ordeal that nearly broke his men, the endless grey monotony of it, the foul air, and the strain of living for 2 months in a steel tube beneath the sea. It is a genuinely astonishing claim. There is, however, a problem with it. When the United States Navy interrogated the crew within a month of their surrender, while every detail of the voyage was still fresh in their minds, the report that came out of those interviews said nothing about a 66-day submerged voyage at all. Instead, It described the boat heading north toward the passage between Iceland and Britain, diving when a plane or a ship was sighted, which means the boat was on the surface the rest of the time, and being picked up repeatedly by direction-finding equipment in late May, which is only possible for a boat that is surfaced and using its radio. The commander's story and the Navy's report look almost like two different voyages, agreeing only that the boat crossed the equator on the 23rd of July. The great 66-day dive, the boat's single most famous achievement, is contradicted by the earliest record we have of the voyage. It may be that Schäffer exaggerated a hard passage into a record. It may be that the crew told the Americans less than the whole truth. It cannot now be untangled with certainty. But the claim that made the boat legendary rests on the word of one interested man, and the documents do not entirely support him. Whatever the truth of the long dive, the rest of the journey is not in dispute. After the stop at the Cape Verde Islands, U-977 ran mostly on the surface, on a single diesel to conserve its dwindling fuel down across the equator and along the coast of South America. On the 17th of August 1945, after 108 days at sea, U-977 came into the Argentine port of Mar del Plata and surrendered. The war in Europe had been over for more than 3 months. The war in the Pacific had ended 2 days before, and a German U-boat had just arrived in Argentina, months late, out of nowhere, with a story no one could immediately check. The rumours began almost at once, and some of them are still repeated to this day. A U-boat that appeared in Argentina long after the war, having made a strange and secretive voyage across the world, was an irresistible mystery, and the world's newspapers filled the blank with the most sensational answers they could imagine. The first and most famous was that U-977 had carried Adolf Hitler himself to South America, that the Führer had not died in his bunker at all, but had slipped away by submarine to live out his days in hiding, and that this was the boat that took him. An entire book was published in Argentina, insisting Hitler was alive. Others said the boat had carried Nazi gold, the looted treasure of a fallen regime, sent to fund some future revival. Others still said it had smuggled fleeing SS men and party officials to safety. And in the years that followed, the stories grew wilder, until one book claimed that U-977 had carried an urn holding the ashes of Hitler and Eva Braun to a secret ice cave in Antarctica built by the U-boats years before. The legend, once loose, kept climbing into ever stranger territory. Argentina was not a random destination, and that was part of the problem. The country had stayed neutral through almost the entire war, declaring against Germany only in its final weeks, and it harboured deep sympathies for the Axis cause and a large and influential German population. Under Juan Perón, who would take the presidency the following year, it would become the most notorious refuge in the world for fleeing Nazis, the far end of the secret escape routes that smuggled war criminals out of Europe. A German U-boat arriving there in secret, months after the surrender, could hardly have chosen a setting better designed to feed suspicion. If the Führer or his gold or his lieutenants were going to slip away anywhere, the popular imagination said, it would be to exactly this coast. U-977 had sailed into the one country where the wildest version of its own story seemed, to a great many people, entirely believable. The suspicion was not confined to the tabloids, because U-977 and another boat, U-530, had both turned up in Argentina months after the surrender. The Allies took the matter seriously enough to investigate. The crews were interrogated in the United States and in Britain, questioned about whether they had sunk a Brazilian cruiser that had been lost that summer, and about whether they had landed Nazi leaders in Argentina before giving themselves up. The questions were asked, and the answers checked, and the crews were cleared of all of it. Because none of it was true, and the reasons are worth laying out. In the spring of 1945, the U-boat arm was being slaughtered, with more than half of all boats at sea being lost. A fleeing U-boat was one of the worst escape vehicles imaginable, far more likely to be sunk than to reach safety. Anyone as valuable as Hitler, or any senior figure trying to escape with treasure, would have demanded a large, long-ranged ocean-going U-boat built for the distance, a Type 9, not a medium-range workhorse like the Type 7 that had spent the war as a trainer. And the man in command was a 24-year-old junior officer an implausible choice to be entrusted with the most important passenger in the world. There is one more detail that settles it. Schäffer said under interrogation that his intention all along had been to hand the boat over to the Allies undamaged, believing its engines might even be of some use in rebuilding Europe. A man planning to surrender his boat intact is not a man running a secret mission to save the Reich. Every piece of evidence pointed the same way. The boat carried no one and nothing of the kind. It carried a scared young captain and a crew of young men running from a defeated country toward a place they hoped would treat them better. The simple truth fit every fact. Schäffer himself spent years trying to kill the story. In 1952, he published a memoir of the voyage, the first book written after the war by a former U-boat officer. And he wrote it in large part to put the Hitler rumors to rest, to say plainly that there had been no Führer aboard, no gold, no secret mission, only the long run to Argentina and the reasons behind it. And there is a quiet irony in the book, because while it stated the plain truth about what the boat carried, its very title carried the boat's other doubtful claim, the 66 days beneath the water that the record does not quite support. The book written to bury one myth helped carry another, and the Hitler stories, for all his efforts, outlived him. They were still being told long after the men who could have answered them were gone. The boat itself did not last long after its great voyage. U-977 was handed over to the United States Navy late in 1945 and taken north, where it was shown off in a string of American ports as a war prize, the famous runaway U-boat that had crossed the world to surrender. And then, having survived a war it never fought in, and a voyage that should have killed its crew, it was expended. In November 1946, U-977 was sunk off the coast of Massachusetts, used as a target in a torpedo test by an American submarine. The boat that had gone to such lengths to avoid being destroyed was destroyed anyway, quietly, as a piece of practice, a year after it arrived. Heinz Schäffer, in the end, got the thing he had run for. After his interrogation and imprisonment, he was released, and he emigrated to Argentina, the country he had crossed an ocean to reach, and he lived out most of the rest of his life there before he died in 1979, still only in his late 50s. The young men who had followed him scattered into new lives in a new country, or drifted home to the old one, and the boat that had carried them became famous not for anything it did in the war, but for the escape it made after it, and for a legend it never asked for, and could never quite shake. That is the strange shape of the story of U-977. It was an ordinary boat, a bystander to the fighting, and then, in the days after the guns fell silent, it made one long and desperate run that turned it into a mystery the world could not leave alone. The truth of that run was strange enough on its own. A scared crew, a grueling voyage, a surrender in a distant land. But the truth was never enough for the people who told the story afterward, and so the plain history of a beaten navy's last runaway was buried for decades, under gold that was never aboard, and a passenger who was never there.